Everything is marketing, right? I mean, people talk about each new GPU launch like it should be better than the last one with a similar number, but brands get to pick and choose what constitutes an entry-level or mid-range or high-end card. There is no objective standard behind the model number beyond what the marketing folks think they can get away with. The same is true of CPUs. For a decade, Intel's i7 was the gold standard of performance, the very best there was. Until it wasn't. This video was sponsored by AliExpress, and they also made it possible. I bought the i9-7900X CPU featured in this video, as well as the CPU cooler and case from sellers on AliExpress, and they kindly provided the Asus Prime X299 motherboard to review it with. If you're looking for a good price on a modern platform from a lesser known brand, an older premium motherboard from a famous marque, a budget X99 board to pair with a super cheap server CPU, or a vintage classic for your collection, you can find them all on AliExpress. The 15th anniversary sale is now on until 11 PM UK time on the 26th of March 2025, with discounts of up to 80%, and you can use my discount codes to get up to £35 off. If that's not enough, you can claim at least 5% cashback by joining the Iceberg Tech team, either by typing Iceberg Tech into the AliExpress app's search bar, or by using the QR code on screen now. The bigger the team grows and the more we spend, the bigger the cashback amount grows, up to a maximum of 15%, which can then be redeemed against your next purchase from AliExpress. The more you buy, the more you save. The app also features games like Prizeland, where you can earn endless coupons and high-value prizes, plus win a share of £800,000. While the mainstream Coffee Lake i9s wouldn't arrive until 2019, the HEDT models for Socket 2066 arrived all the way back in the middle of 2017. The first chip to bear this new prefix was this, the i9-7900X. Built on Skylake X architecture using the 14nm lithography, which was already a couple of years old at that point, the first i9 was the very definition of, this one goes to 11. The CPU it replaced, the Broadwell E-based i7-6950X, was made using the same process node, has the same number of cores and threads, and actually slightly more L3 cache. Which, I don't think I can explain this one. From a gaming perspective at least, there doesn't seem to be a good reason for the step down from 25MB to 14, and while the L2 cache was increased from 256K per core to 1MB, I don't know if that was the right call. In fact, to this day, Intel's 10-core CPUs have never returned to the dizzying heights of 25MB, though, of course, a 10-core ain't what it used to be. Unfortunately, I don't have a 6950X to compare the 7900X to today, but if enough people like this, I'll see if I can buy one and maybe do a head-to-head. Instead, I'll occasionally throw in some numbers from some of my recent CPU reviews for some context, but for the most part, I'm interested in simply how the first ever i9 holds up in gaming in the 2020s. When it was new, there wasn't much point in a 10-core chip for anyone beyond power users and enthusiasts. But 8 years later, there are far more games that can take advantage of all these threads. I've paired the i9 with 32GB of DDR4 3600 CL14, which is a 4x8GB kit to take advantage of the quad-channel memory controller. It's installed on the Asus Prime X299A Mark II motherboard, cooled with a Thermalright 360mm AIO, powered by a Corsair 1200W PSU, and graphics are provided by an RX 7900 XT from Sapphire. I have to say, for a 2017 CPU, I'm surprised how modern this platform is. I know X299 lasted a few generations, and this is a later model from around 2019 or so, and yet I was still faintly surprised to see front panel USB-C support, pins for RGB headers, multiple M.2 slots. It's all a bit too early for Gen 4 PCI Express, but on the whole this is easy to mistake for a much newer platform. Setting up wasn't too problematic, the XMP profile worked like a charm, and I'm sure I could probably have reached some pretty high clock speeds on the CPU itself. However, I was a bit concerned by the 7900X's reputation. Obviously, being a premium, high-end CPU in a new market segment for Intel, they cheaped out. Thanks in part to the cost-cutting measure of swapping out solder for thermal paste, this generation of chip was known for periodically spiking up to some very high temps. If I were looking to use this chip in the long term, I'd consider de-lidding and swap that paste out for some liquid metal, but for the purpose of this review I settled on a fairly conservative 4.7 GHz at 1.28 volts, which idled in the mid-20s, but ran in the 80s and 90s during stress tests, and with random spikes up over 100 degrees. Kicking off with everyone's favourite, the first i9 is still kind of a monster in CS2. At an average of 280 FPS, and with excellent 1% lows, this is the kind of performance you'd expect from a non-3D 5000 series Ryzen. The downside is that the newer AMD chip would be able to achieve these numbers on about half the power consumption, but if you're not the one paying the electricity bill, this could still be the CPU for you. Nobody has a good experience in Stalker 2, just degrees of badness. Well, technically speaking anyway. I haven't played enough of the game to pass that kind of judgment, though that would be kind of fitting for a post-apocalyptic survival game. In a CPU-limited scenario, the i9 can't hit 60 FPS, averaging just 53 with lows in the 30s. This is one game that wants you to use frame generation, and I don't think there's a way around it with this CPU. Space Marine 2 can bring modern budget CPUs and even higher end CPUs of this generation to their knees, especially when someone opens the tab marked Tyrannid Swarm. At moments like this, the i9 can still remain playable at just over 60 FPS, with lows in the 50s but with the occasional distracting stutter. Spider-Man 2 is new to me, so I don't have any other CPUs to compare it to in this version of Manhattan. I have seen that it can be pretty stuttery on mobile CPUs like the Ryzen AI9 HX370, which has more cores but which aren't all on the same CCD and which aren't all operating at full power. In that regard at least, the i9 isn't caught short. Without ray tracing, it manages a fairly smooth 80 FPS, with lows dropping a little below 50. Ray tracing performs significantly worse, failing to hit a 60 average. And yes, you can see from the stats that the GPU isn't at full usage, so the CPU is definitely the limiting factor. Hitman 3's built-in benchmark is on another level in terms of being CPU demanding. It's not often we get to see physics engines do this kind of damage to a frame rate, and despite being a few years old now, I think it might be worth keeping around for future CPU tests. Without RT, the i9 can handle frames up to 120 FPS, though super heavy physics intensive scenes drop below 60. With RT switched on, the average drops below 80 and lows to just above 40 FPS. The biggest stability test this CPU faced was actually caching shaders in The Last of Us Part 1. And it failed. I had to restart the game about 6 times before getting this far. Once in-game, everything seemed to be stable, and performance was excellent, almost 110 FPS on average, with decent, if not amazing, 1% lows. I know there's not a lot of love in the audience for it, but Starfield remains a great test for CPUs. The average of over 70 FPS is fine, certainly comparable to the non-X3D Zen 3 chips I've mentioned before, but the 1% lows of 44 reflect a less than ideal experience. There are always a few loading stutters in New Atlantis, and the i9 doesn't handle them particularly well. On the other hand, I'm keeping Dragon Age Veilguard around precisely because it's a well-optimised game, and not some UE5 slop that's demanding for the sake of being demanding, so apologies if it's not your cup of tea, but I find it's good to have a bit of balance in the benchmark roster. The 7900X performs superbly here, averaging 115 FPS without RT. Turning on RT causes a big drop, with averages falling to the mid-70s, but still very much playable. I make myself feel bad with this one. I made the decision at the start of 2025 to stop doing custom benchmarks in Cyberpunk 2077 and just use the built-in one, and I'm already starting to regret it. I ran the old custom test out of habit and saw much lower numbers than I did from the canned benchmark. You could argue that the canned benchmark, which is a bit less demanding overall, is more of a balanced representation of performance, where my version is a worst case scenario. However, it's not a small difference. Without RT, the built-in benchmark is over 90% higher than the custom one, and with RT turned on, it's still a margin of about 40%. Either way, it's playable, just not as impressive sounding in real-world testing. Unfortunately, I don't really have a good enough graphics card to fully test Star Wars Outlaws with RTX direct illumination enabled. Even at 720p, averaging 71 FPS with the most aggressive level of FSR upscaling, the RX 7900 XT is the limiting factor. Without full RT turned on, I was able to get past this bottleneck, and because the game is still using RT global illumination, and thanks to its open world design and range of NPCs milling around, it can still be genuinely demanding on the CPU. The i9 stays mostly above 60 FPS with an average of 86. Finally, a CPU test from the year the 7900X released. 2017's Assassin's Creed Origins struggled on mainstream CPUs in its day, with even overclocked Ryzen 1700Xs and 2700Xs running in the high 60s and low 70s. The i9 is outstanding in that context, achieving almost 100 FPS. Despite the modern-feeling platform and solid gaming performance, synthetic benchmarks show just how far CPUs have come in the last 8 years. Cinebench R23 sees a multi-core score of over 15k, which, compared to the i7 8700K or i9 9900K, is a phenomenal result. But it's also 1500 points less than a mobile Ryzen from 2 years ago. A 12th gen i9, despite relying on E-cores to make itself look more impressive, scores almost double. I don't have many results from Cinebench 24 to compare with, but I do happen to have an 8-core Ryzen from every generation released for the AM4 socket, and in this company, the 7900X holds up remarkably well. Only the 5700X surpasses it, though the 3700X has it beaten in single-core performance, and higher core count Ryzens from that generation would no doubt win in the multi-core test as well. Geekbench 6 is another good result for the 7900X, holding up well against even Ryzen 5000 series, though again, it's a sign of the times that the i5 12400F just beats it in multi-core and blitzes it in single-core. Plus, if I drop this 200-watt water-cooled beast of a chip into my mini-PC leaderboard, it'll be about halfway up, somewhere around the modern Ryzen 5s and Core Ultra 5s. The 7900X does curiously well in Time Spy, beating some serious competition with a CPU score of over 12,000. Hell, this is the first time I can say there are no mobile chips better than it. Despite upending the Intel Core series, relegating the i7 to the status of second best, and helping justify ever-increasing prices, the i9's time on this earth was limited. The last series of CPUs to bear this moniker have already been released, and the 14th generation didn't exactly end on a high note. The Core Ultra series that replaces it haven't found their footing just yet, and with the arc of history currently favouring AMD, it remains to be seen how long it is before Intel can regain the performance crown. As for the 7900X, despite some well-founded concerns at the time, the first i9 hasn't held up too badly, almost 8 years after its release. And while I'm not about to encourage anyone to buy one as a daily driver, it's not time to send it for recycling just yet. Thanks again to AliExpress for sponsoring the video and providing the parts for review. Check out the discount codes below and don't forget to join the Iceberg tech team before you buy. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.